Hello, everybody. Welcome to my channel. My name is Claire, and I like to read books, so I'm going to talk about it on the internet. um, and today I'm going to start out with an old favorite. One of my favorite things to do is to watch people's monthly reading wrap-ups on here, and so I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk about what I read in September. I actually filmed myself talking about the first two books way back at the beginning of the month because I was initially going to make like an Instagram reel, and then I decided to just do a video. So I'm going to insert that footage here instead of like recapping it.
The first book I read this month was something I actually listened to via audiobook, and that was Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys, right here. This is the one that won him the Pulitzer, and deservedly so, I think. The thing I really like about him is, his writing is beautiful, and even in Harlem Shuffle, which I didn't enjoy quite as much, I really enjoyed his writing and his turns of phrase and the humor, and sort of just wry irony that he writes with. And that was definitely on display in The Nickel Boys. But more so, I really was so impressed by his character building. I think The Underground Railroad was very character driven, of course, but was a little bit more plot driven than character driven. And the characters in The Nickel Boys were just so alive and so, even the minor ones, even the ones that didn't have a lot of page time, were just so well rounded and well envisioned, and it felt like I knew them. And I think that's like what writers try to do, to make us care about characters. If it is a character-driven novel, which it isn't always, but that's like what writers strive to do, and I think he did such an incredible job with that in this book. It's heartbreaking. It's a difficult book to read, not just because it's entirely based on true events and true stories of a school similar to the Nichols School for Boys, um, that did operate in Florida up until extremely recently. The depictions of abuse and cruelty and violence in this book are not made up. It's all based on reports from the school. And so, of course, that's a really difficult thing to read, and also a really important thing to read. The twist at the end, which I will not give away if you have not read this book, was totally unexpected for me and a shock. And he did such a good job of leading up to it and dropping enough hints that it was like, well, of course, but without giving it away in advance. So I really liked this book. I gave it 4 stars. I really liked the audiobook reader as well. I think it's a really well produced and well done audiobook. So that's Nickel Boy's first book. My second book that I read was Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. This book is an absolute trip. We start off here with Tracker, who is the Red Wolf in the title, and he's basically a hired mercenary who's known for his tracking abilities to search for this boy, this missing boy, who maybe nobody really can tell him why he's so important. No one will tell him why he wants to be found or where he's gone. And so this book is kind of about him figuring out who this boy is, why people want to find him, and also going like why he's bothering, basically, other than like making a bunch of money. For the first 100 pages, I was like, I'm not going to finish this book. I don't have any idea what's happening. It took me like 3 days to read the first 100 pages, and that was not with like, oh, I'm like gonna read this while I eat breakfast and brush my teeth at night or whatever. It was like sitting down with the intention to read and spending time and not getting through it. This is a very baffling book, and it's a very kind of hallucinatory book. It is not plot driven. It is strange, and yes, if you decide to pick this up and you are a person who is sometimes not very smart, like me, and has trouble following narratives, like me, you're probably going to have some difficulty in the first 100 pages. The first half of this book, I got through the first part. The second part started. That part is more plot-driven and actually, like, gets more into, like, a chronological telling of events. And I was like, okay, I can do this. it's still taking me forever to read, and I'm not sure I'm enjoying it. Um, but I'm following the thread. I do kind of want to know what happens, so I kept reading it. And then I hit the halfway mark, and the main character, the narrator, realizes something and kind of makes a connection. And I was like, oh, okay. And then for the last half, I was like, I was very into it, and still not reading it quickly, but was really, really drawn into the story, drawn into the writing style, drawn into the characters in a way that I wasn't in the first half. As I already said, this book is strange. It is a difficult read. It demands a lot from the reader. It's not like a pickup before you go to bed and you're tired thing. It's not a light read by any means. But it's also, I think, a very rewarding read because of that difficulty. There are many, many layers in this book, and you're peeling them away as you read, and you're realizing, first of all, that the narrator is not a reliable narrator. And really, none of the characters in this book are reliable. Witnesses, they're all lying to each other. Everyone has another sort of game they're playing. The real story of what the sort of story you hear at the beginning is not, they're not the same. You kind of have to uncover the real story and what's going on as you read. This book, I wouldn't call this book character driven at all, nor is it plot driven. It is, I really don't know what drives it. I mean, the narrative does drive it, and sort of the philosophical, I sound like such an right now. It's really about the philosophy in this one. No, but it is like, this book is about power, and it's about power dynamics. It's about what love is and how love is shown between people, and how we fail each other and also hold each other up. It is a very like classical sort of high fantasy story with a lot of familiar tropes, kings, coups, mercenaries, magical creatures, a quest, while also being like unlike any high fantasy I've read before, primarily because it's written by Marlon James, who is obviously taking all of those things and turning them on their heads, and also because it is set in Iron Age Africa, and it is very much, or a world that's inspired by Iron Age Africa, and is very much embracing all of those myths and traditions and culture. And I think for a Western reader, especially a white person from a Christian background who lives in the US, this is unfamiliar ground for a lot of us as readers, because it's not something that's really been getting, it's not voices or experiences or worlds that have been uplifted in Western literature. The main character, the narrator, is like, again, for the first 100 pages, totally have no idea what's going on. And then I found him just really annoying for the first couple hundred pages. And then by the end of the book, I was like so endeared by him and so attached to him, because I think one of the, like I said, he's an unreliable narrator, and he wants you to believe as the reader, as the person telling the story, that he is hard and cruel and unlovable and all of these things, but he is like an extremely tender person in reality who is moving through this world of like incredible violence. And speaking of incredible violence, this book should come with every trigger warning in the book. So if you are sensitive to violence, every page of this book is blood soaked. If you're sensitive to sexual violence, especially in rape, there's a lot of this in this book. If you're sensitive to really horrific situations with children, whether that be sexual violence or general violence or dismembering or like really just horrible stuff, it's all in here. Bestiality, homophobia. It's pretty misogynistic in points because the character, especially at the beginning, is quite misogynistic. It's not, like I said, it's not fun. It's not an easy read. I think if you're a really big lover of high fantasy, if you enjoy like the idea of a quest story and kind of an ensemble cast, And if you're also interested in very complex characters and very complex questions, and kind of, again, a lot about human nature and the nature of power and violence, this is definitely worth a read.
So the third book I read this month was Jonathan Scoffrey's If I Survive You, which was recently shortlisted for the Booker Prize 2023. And I usually try, or for the past couple years, I've tried to read at least the entire shortlist for the Booker. Last year I read most of the long list too, and I just haven't done it this year, partially because I live in a really small town now, and our library is quite wonderful, but doesn't have a ton of like really new books, and it's kind of hard to order them. I'm not near a bookstore anymore, so it just hasn't happened. But I was able to get my hands on this one, and I read it, and I really enjoyed it. I think it makes sense that it was nominated for the Booker. It kind of fits in that vibe. It follows Trelawney, who's the son of Jamaican immigrants in Miami, and kind of his coming of age and what he deals with when it comes to like racial relations, his own identity, his parents and his family and those dynamics, and just kind of finding his way in the world as a Jamaican and a black man in America. And I thought it was really well written. It's actually a series, I mean, I think it's billed as a series of short stories that are all interconnected. 4 of them, I think, are told by Trelawney, and then there's one from his father's perspective, one from his brother's perspective, and one from his cousin's perspective. And the way they're told is really interesting. This is one of the few books that I feel like uses second person really well, because some of the stories are told in second person using you. And I really like that when it works. Last year's winner of the Booker Prize, The 7 Moons of Molly Almeida, is written entirely in the second person and was so well done, in my opinion. I really liked that book, and I thought that was super effective. It works really well in this book, too. And I liked the way the story kind of flowed through all of the shorter segments. The center segment, which is about Trelawney's cousin, who really doesn't figure that much in the book other than that. I didn't really understand the point of that story being in it, and I'm not going to say anything about the story itself or what happens in it because I don't want to cause any spoilers, but it was essentially dropped in there, was not ever referred to again, and that kind of threw a wrench in the whole book for me a little bit in the way it flowed. And so that's my one criticism of it. I thought it was really well written. I think Jonathan Escoffrey is a beautiful writer. I'm really excited to read more of his work. And the book itself was the subject matter, the way that he tackles kind of family dynamics and all of that, I thought it was really well done. But I think the structure and pacing suffered a little bit because of the way it was put together and the perspectives he decided to use. So that was my one drawback there, but I overall really did like the book. So I think I gave it 4 stars. I can't quite remember. Next up, I read All This Could Be Different by Sarah Thankin Matthews. I loved this book. I really love this book. We follow our main character, Sneha, who is who's from India. She was born there, and then she came to the U.S. with her parents when she was in school, went through, I think, middle school and high school in the United States, and then her parents, her dad in particular, was deported back to India, but she was able to stay on a student visa and then on a work visa after college was over. And that's really important to her because she wants to be able to continue sending money to her parents, and just she wants to stay in the U.S. So in order to maintain her work visa or eventually get citizenship, she has to be sponsored essentially by an employer. And she's really hoping that this guy, who is the head of a consulting agency who hires her out of college, will be that sponsor for her if she sticks with him for long enough. This is set, I think, in the early 2010s, so it's following the financial crisis, graduating from college into that sort of economic situation was very difficult for people. It's still difficult to find good jobs out of college, I think. And this is set in Milwaukee, so very much a city that was still suffering after the financial crisis while also dealing with a lot of increased cost of living and gentrification. This book talks a lot about all of that. It talks about kind of the struggles also of just existing in late capitalism and how so much of our lives are bound up in our job and how that is kind of the expectation, even though it's not necessarily healthy and also oftentimes goes above and beyond what your pay grade is. As it turns out, I don't think this is a spoiler, the boss of this company she works for is kind of a scummy guy and kind of just things don't go the way she wants them to. And so this is about her just navigating that, navigating the workplace, navigating her social life, making new friends. It centers one of her best friends from college who also works at this company, and a new friend who she meets actually through dating apps, but who becomes one of her best friends, and then her various kind of love interests and dates, especially the woman who eventually becomes her girlfriend. So this is a really tender look at, I think, just millennials, kind of the pressures that this generation faces. Some really interesting and deep also exploration of racial identity and immigrant identity. And Sneha is a lesbian, and that's like a really important part of her identity and the way that she conducts herself in the world in the US. And it's something that she feels like she has to completely hide from her parents and her family and her culture back home. And so there is also a lot of really interesting commentary kind of on that like double life that you have to live, and what that does to you to feel like you can't you can't be fully yourself. There's also a lot of commentary just on, like I said already, late capitalism, sort of the urge that I think a lot of people have to like reinvest in community while feeling more isolated than ever before because of just the way society works in our jobs. And yeah, I think I loved it so much because it was so deeply relatable in so many ways. And I cried through the last little bit of it. It just feels very true to life. Like nothing is over dramatized, but also nothing is sugar coated. And I thought it was just really beautiful. I think a lot of people have mixed feelings on this. You know, it's kind of one of those books that people either seem to really love or really dislike. But I really loved it. Next up, another really good one that I enjoyed, Ink Blood Sister Scribe. This is a book, a fantasy novel about a magic system where basically spells are written in an ink made of blood into books, and then when they're read with some other like ritualistic elements involved, that magic, the spell is cast. And that's a really oversimplified version of it. One of the things I liked the most about this book was the world building, and it felt like one of those books that I really wanted to just curl up with and sink into. I wanted to like really inhabit this world. The author does a really good job of world building and of describing it and of making you understand kind of what's going on without just info dumping on you, which is, I think, a skill with fantasy novels that sometimes people don't hit quite right, but they did here. Two sisters who grew up in a house full of books with parents who were kind of magic book collectors. At one point, the older sister, what's her name? Esther. At one point, the older sister, Esther, kind of right when she graduates high school, is told that she has to leave the family home and never come back, because if she comes back, she'll be putting her family in danger and the books. And so she leaves and never comes back, and she leaves and travels every single year. Like, she doesn't stay longer than a year in any given place. But this book opens with her deciding to stay longer in where she is currently, which is Antarctica, because she's fallen in love with someone there, and she's tired of running, and she doesn't even know why she's running. Her sister Joanna lives in the family home still, their father has recently died because of a cursed book, but they don't really know what the curse was or why or what happened. And so it's all very mysterious. It's all very, just kind of like the puzzle pieces slowly shift together. There are multiple viewpoints and perspectives. There's some other characters who are also in this who eventually come and everyone kind of meets together. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. There's some pitfalls, like the first novel pitfalls. There's a few plot holes. There's a few things that are like a little too convenient and maybe like weren't thought out that well. And a couple of the side characters, more side characters, are a little one-dimensional. But overall, I really enjoyed it. And the ending does leave it open for more, possibly. So I kind of am hoping that we're going to have a continuation or a sequel, because I would love to dive back into this world. If you like fantasy that is not like high fantasy, but has a really cool magic system and really lovable characters and feels kind of just cozy, this is a good book for you. Next up, we're getting into the ones that I did not love as much. I read Big Swiss. Big Swiss is a book that everyone seems to be reading right now, and people seem to either really love it or really hate it, and I did not like it. For those of you who don't know, Big Swiss is about a 45-year-old woman named Greta who lives in an old farmhouse with her friend, and who has kind of done a lot of different odd jobs in her life, never really settled down, and now she's working as a transcriber for a therapist, so she's basically typing up therapy sessions. She lives in a small town in Hudson, New York, and so she inevitably runs into a lot of the people who she's transcribing sessions for. And basically, this book is about her becoming obsessed with one of the therapist's patients, meeting her in real life, and then essentially using the knowledge she has from these therapy sessions to woo her. And that, I think, is a really cool premise. I picked up the book for a reason, but it just didn't work for me. The writing was fine. It wasn't bad. Like, it didn't feel like it was like difficult to get through. It was engaging. But I just think that this book had a lot of potential to like be really interesting and explore that dynamic. And it is kind of written as a satire. There's very satirical moments. There's funny moments. There's parts where like I was reading and I was like, oh, this is like, I see where this is going. This is really good commentary. And then it just never gets followed through with. It felt like a satire that wasn't doing the job of a satire, which is to like really comment on society and other people, and it didn't feel like it was doing that. I think a lot of people have already talked about this. Jesse on YouTube has a really good video about this book. There's some reviews on Goodreads that really lay out kind of all of the issues with it, but there are some very strange and racist things in this book, and they're not really like the characters saying racist stuff. It's like embedded in the writing itself. Strange things about Japanese and Chinese people. There's a really odd section where the main character compares the way her dog is acting to like trans identity. It felt like the sapphic relationship in this book was a little bit fetishized and not like, I don't know. I was reading it, and as a person who is queer and who loves women, I was reading the sex scenes and they just made me feel uncomfortable. Yeah, I don't know. There was just something a little bit off about that for me. That is just my opinion on that. A lot of people have said this is really great sapphic representation, and they're so excited to read this book, and I'm like, I can think of a lot of books that are better. I think there's a wider conversation of like, and people have also mentioned this in conversations about this book, but there's like the genre of like unlikable female characters doing shitty things to other people. It's like a genre now. I don't think I like the genre very much. I've read some books that do it really well. I actually like Atesha Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation quite a bit, and I feel like that's like the poster child of this kind of genre. But I think that book is self-aware and criticizes itself and is like using this character who is like entirely unlikable and not doing anything about it to like criticize things and make a point. And a lot of books that are in that vein just aren't doing that. And another one that I read this month is Exciting Times by Nosha Dolan, and this felt very similar. This is a book following Ava, who is from Ireland. She graduates college. She feels a little lost, so she goes to teach English to kids in Hong Kong. And this is a book that kind of follows her time there and the people she meets and the people who she has relationships with, particularly Julian, who is a extremely wealthy British banker working in Hong Kong, and Edith, who is was born in Hong Kong and then educated in England and then came back and is now kind of a high-powered lawyer. This is similar, where like at the beginning I was reading this and I was like, this is making some interesting points. This is going somewhere. There's a lot of conversation about colonialism in this book. There's a lot of conversations about language and a lot of conversation about class. I thought specifically, you know, it's an interesting concept of having this character who is Irish, who speaks, whose native language is English because England colonized Ireland, but who also learned Irish when she was a kid, going then to another place that's been colonized by the British and teaching English, and sort of spreading the influence of her own colonizer. Like, I thought that that was interesting, and there's some discussion of that in here, but then it just doesn't get followed through with. And so there's some like stuff in this book that felt really uncomfortable and kind of racist. I'm a white person. I'm not Chinese. I'm not from Hong Kong. I'm not Asian. So I don't know. But there were some things where, like, there's this one section where she's talking about, like, not being able to tell her students apart from each other, not ever learning their names, because especially she knows that, like, if she tried to learn their Chinese names, she would, like, never remember them because they're Chinese. The character of Edith is quite a kind of, I don't know, I read her as a very flat character and a very, like, sort of stereotypical character, and her family as well. And there was just, like, I just didn't love it. Again, it felt like something that had a lot of promise, and it just fell through and didn't get explored, and I was just mostly really bored by it, too. Like, Exciting Times, they were not. It took me forever to finish this book, and it's like 230 pages long. It's not long, but I just was really bored getting through it, so I don't know. Wouldn't recommend. I'm sorry. Next up, this is slightly better. I read Black Sun. I've had this book for a while. I've been meaning to get around to it for a while, and I was really excited to read it. I thought I would love it. And I did like it quite a bit. It is a fantasy novel with a sort of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican inspired world. We're following 3 different characters in 3 different areas of this world, and like kind of following them as they all converge together on the day of the Black Sun, which is an eclipse that is very like holy and important to the religion of this world. I really like books like this. I like complex world building. I like political kind of machinations and thrillers, and this book had all of that, so I really enjoyed those aspects. One of the characters that we followed, like one of the perspectives, I just wasn't that interested in, and I don't think that character was as fully realized as the other 2, and so for me it was like every time we switched to her point of view, I kind of fell out of the story a little bit because I really just wanted to be following the other characters. And that's something that happens sometimes with split perspective narratives. I think sometimes they come together seamlessly and sometimes they don't. And overall, like, it still wasn't a bad reading experience. I read it pretty quickly. I wanted to be reading it. I really wanted to, like, sink my teeth into it, and it was very kind of transporting. But yeah, it didn't quite hit as hard as I thought it was going to, and I didn't love it. I am excited to get my hands on the sequel because it does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, and so I do really want to know what happens now. And yeah, I would say if you like high fantasy and if you like kind of that more politically motivated type of plot, you would probably really like. Those are all the books I read this month. If you have read any of these, have opinions on them, or have recommendations for me, which I'm always looking for, comment down below. Let's talk. Get through the end of this video. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, shoot me a comment. Let's chat about books. I don't know how to end this video without being silly. What's the outro? See y'all later. No, that's bad. I don't know. I'm just going to end the video now.